Hola.
Bé, comencem. Let's get started. Moltes gràcies per ser presents en aquest seminari sobre estratègies internacionals d'àrees metropolitanes. Bienvenidos todos, tanto aquellos que venís a través de la red de grandes ciudades de América Latina, ALAS, como aquellos que venís a través del Instituto del IBEI, ¿no? Que es el que nos ha tenido la gentileza de facilitarnos este local, estas instalaciones y también toda su ayuda organizativa. I també moltes gràcies a tota la gent de l'àrea metropolitana de Barcelona que treballa a l'àrea d'internacional i cooperació i que han fet possible que això es pogués celebrar avui aquí, ¿no? Gracias también a todos los asistentes por vuestra presencia, gente destacada, de ciudades destacadas y que ya están, porque las sesiones empezaron ayer, como sabéis, ya están convirtiendo este encuentro en un éxito, en un auténtico éxito, más que de cantidad, de calidad. Y lo digo porque una de las intenciones, sin duda compartidas por las grandes ciudades o las grandes metrópolis, es apuntar más hacia la calidad que hacia la cantidad. La cantidad ya la tenemos, a veces incluso nos sobra en varios sentidos, pero la calidad es lo que marcará nuestro futuro. Por tanto, aquí también la calidad de los intercambios es lo que puede marcar el éxito de este encuentro. Supongo que una de las preguntas es si las redes de ciudades son útiles. Aquí, como sabéis, estamos conectados gracias a redes como Metròpolis, como Metròpolis, como la red de metrópolis europeas. Y claro, esta pregunta es necesaria porque invertimos tiempo, invertimos también recursos públicos, ¿no? Y un servidor de ustedes, como vicepresidente del área metropolitana y encargado de internacional y cooperación, en época, además, época de vacas flacas, debemos hacernos esta pregunta constantemente, ¿no? ¿Vale la pena realmente invertir este tiempo, estos recursos humanos y materiales? O en algún caso podemos ser más austeros. Yo creo que es necesario hacerlo bien, es necesario hacerlo con probidad y con capacidad de ahorro y de eficacia, pero es necesario porque solo juntos saldremos adelante, solo juntos podremos encarar este reto. Es un reto que afecta a las grandes ciudades, es enorme, es un reto que afecta a todo el planeta y, por tanto, si afecta a todo el planeta tenemos que relacionarnos. Es imprescindible, no hay otra manera de salir adelante y claro, la responsabilidad que pesa sobre las espaldas de aquellos que gobiernan las grandes ciudades y aquellos que nos ayudan o nos ayudáis a gobernar, cada vez es mayor. Una vez le preguntaron al presidente de los Estados Unidos, a Lyndon B. Johnson, I'm going to switch to English, if it's okay. I'm going to switch from one language to the other. They asked, he was an English speaker, so it makes sense. They asked Lyndon B. Johnson whether he felt the weight of responsibility. He had just been elected as the US president, and they asked him, don't you feel all this weight on your shoulders? And he said, well, it could be worse. And they asked him, what do you mean? Could be worse than this? And he said, yes, I could have been elected mayor. Now, okay, yes, it's kind of funny, but it's also true. It's also true because the thing with mayors is that they're so close to people. And we have some former mayors among us who know very well what that means. But mayors are so close to the population and so close to problems that the weight is larger in the sense that you take it to bed with you. And whoever is involved with governance in great cities takes all these problems, the problems of the city, the problems of the people of society, takes them with him on his shoulders. Nowadays, cities have a great responsibility in the world. So, in a way, the future of humankind, and the future of the world is on our shoulders. Every one of us in this room, because we're involved with governance in cities, whether exercising government or trying to improve it and advise on governance. But we share this enormous responsibility. And it's even greater than in Lyndon B. Johnson's time, which was something like 50 years ago. Why? Well, because 50% of the population nowadays in the world is in cities. So the urban phenomenon is more than half of the human phenomenon. Sustainability, to a very great extent, has to do with cities and how we plan our cities, how we face challenges of sustainability. Industry, whatever industry we want to have, is also something which has to do with cities. The technological revolution basically takes place, and the future will be determined in cities. Cities are a hot place for jobs, for opportunities. That's where people go to search for opportunities. And that happened in Roman cities, that happened in the Middle Ages, that happens in our cities as well. It's a good city, a city which works, is basically a big concentration of talent. And when we say talent, of course we say business, and we say success, and we say solutions, and we say improvement, and we also say balancing our own society with expertise. So we carry all that responsibility on our shoulders. In a way, my function right now here opening all these sessions is to make you aware of the responsibility you're carrying on your shoulders. I'm sorry for the bad news, but it's really like that. It's I would encourage you to be very much aware of the challenge which we all face when we're discussing about metropolitan areas and the future of metropolitan areas, how we relate to each other, and how we can share our opinion, our experiences, and our solutions. It's not a minor issue. It's probably not only a big issue, but probably one of the biggest, or perhaps, let me say it, the biggest issue we face. What are we going to do with cities, from cities, between cities, big cities of the planet? There was Jane Jacobs, I'm sure you are familiar with her, activist in the Greenwich Village, and a lady I admire, because he said something very obvious. He said obvious things which must be said. Like when she said, the key for cities are the sidewalks. The sidewalk is the key for the city. Now that might seem obvious in a European city, although I'm not so sure. In an American and a US city, or generally a city of the Americas, it is not obvious, and it was not at all obvious in the 60s when she said it. But the sidewalk, that's where we relate, that's where we talk to each other, that's where we fight, that's where we encounter most of the problems and most of our happiness. That's where our kids can play. That's the public space, the most human of public spaces and cities. So I would also encourage you to be faithful to those who said obvious things, who made light out of the functions and the future of cities. She also said something else, which was really what I wanted to point out right now. She said that cities are about development, in the sense that she used the word development, when she said that, well, if expansion is about growth, pure growth, development is about change, and change is about improvement. So when we talk about development, we're not talking about making cities big. And here I go back to the beginning. We're talking about making cities better, how we can improve them, how we can change them. So we've seen it, we've even seen it in politics and in recent changes we've been seeing all over the world. Also in our country, in our city, in this metropolitan area of Barcelona, we've seen that probably the big issue is change. How do you change a city, and how do you change it in the right direction? And that will probably be present more and more for us in the future. And I'm sure that's also what encourages you to come here and to debate and discuss about all the issues which you are going to debate from now on. So be very welcome. I'm sure that when we talk about strategy, and as far as I know, this seminar is about metropolitan strategies, international strategies. We are talking about setting goals, and the paramount of all goals is change, in the sense that Jane Jacobs used it, improvement. And we're also talking about which tools we can use for that improvement. Tools like planning, funding, participation, budgeting, most of the things which end with ing. They have to do with tools which are useful for changing and improving our cities. Me gustaría volver a Barcelona y con esto ya acabar y pues dejar el micrófono a gente mucho más sabia, experta y seguramente esperada, mucho más esperada que yo mismo, al menos en este entorno. En el caso de nuestra ciudad, por ejemplo, estoy seguro de que la manera de llegar a ese objetivo de cambio y de mejora es usando las fortalezas que tenemos. Por tanto, en cualquier estrategia de internacionalización, de importación y exportación, hay que tener en cuenta cuáles son las fortalezas y cuáles son las debilidades. Las fortalezas nos pueden servir para compensar las debilidades. Si me hablan ustedes, pues, cuáles son las fortalezas de Barcelona, en mi opinión, pues les diría algunas. Yo creo que Barcelona es fuerte en atracción de talento, en atracción, en magnetismo internacional, en turismo, por supuesto, forma parte de esa atractividad. Es fuerte en lo que se refiere también, por su atractivo, por su magnetismo, a la atracción de todo ese mundo que innova en el campo de las nuevas tecnologías, el Congreso de Móviles, de Smart Cities, etc. Todo eso funciona bien en Barcelona, así como todo lo que tiene que ver con el ocio, con la alimentación, con la gastronomía, con el vino. Por lo tanto, ya tenemos esas fortalezas. Pero hay grandes debilidades que tienen que ver con la fractura social, que tienen muchas ciudades, aquí también, y es profunda, y es preocupante, y es creciente, ¿no? Debilidades que tienen que ver también con el envejecimiento de las ciudades. La gente joven tiende a irse del centro de las ciudades, o de las ciudades, puramente. Y aquí, además, pues el talento joven también tiene tendencia a emigrar al menos en los últimos años de crisis, esta es una de las debilidades claras de nuestra ciudad. Por tanto, el magnetismo que tenemos es un magnetismo que es parcial. Y, en mi opinión, la estrategia de internacionalización de Barcelona debería pasar por usar esas fortalezas que ya tenemos y llenar los vacíos que todavía tenemos. Es decir, no debe ser tan difícil, y eso es algo que me gustaría hablar, discutir con todos ustedes, porque si nos dieran la solución a ese reto, yo creo que aquellos que nos dedicamos a la cosa pública seríamos mucho más felices. Es decir, cómo usamos ese enorme magnetismo que tenemos en algunos campos para proyectarlo a otros campos donde no lo tenemos. ¿Cómo retenemos a la gente joven? ¿Cómo atraemos al joven, al talento joven y a la gente que se está formando? Y a nuestra propia gente joven, que se va a otros sitios para buscar mejores oportunidades. Si una ciudad, una gran ciudad, es un gran imán de talento, pues ¿cómo lo ponemos en práctica en esos sectores, con esa gente que no lo ven como tal o que no lo pueden usar como tal? En fin, animarles a que discutan estas cosas y otras muchas cosas que sin duda pues traerán, nos presentarán aquí, pero sobre todo animarles a seguir en la senda de eso que nos indicaba Jane Jacobs, ¿no? De considerar el desarrollo como desarrollo, es decir, como cambio, y como cambio a mejor, como mejora, y no simplemente como crecimiento, y hacerlo también a través de lo que me parece que es una norma universal, pero eso también igual pues, les interesa discutirlo. A mí me parece que es usar siempre tus fortalezas, y en el ámbito de la internacionalización también, usar siempre tus fortalezas para combatir tus debilidades como ciudad. Eso seguramente es la clave para salir adelante. Si lo hacemos solos, nos costará mucho más y difícilmente aprenderemos. Si lo hacemos juntos e intercambiamos, seguramente será más rápido, será más eficaz y la solución será mucho más sólida. Pues nada más, muchas gracias por su atención durante estos minutos y ahora les quisiera presentar al próximo ponente. Let me introduce you to Dr. Simon Curtis, sitting here right next to Simon Curtis is a lecturer in international relations at the University of East Anglia in the UK. And he's also senior fellow in global cities at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Simon joined the University of East Anglia in 2009 after completing his doctorate in international relations at the London School of Economics, LSE, and political science, where, as far as we know, you held the LSE International Relations Department's Michael Leifer Scholarship, pronounce it like that, Michael Leifer. He's the author of The Power of Cities in International Relations in 2014, Reassembling International Theory, same year, also with Michele Acuto. And his next book, Global Cities and Global Order, which must be published by now, or almost? November, will be released in November, will be published by the Oxford University Press this year, and where Simon examines the importance of global cities in the transformation of world order. I know he's also, because Simon, somebody told me about that you're very vocal and you're very passionate about the issue of Brexit. So I'm not sure whether you're going to talk about that, but if you want to introduce it, we were also very much involved with that, and it's one of the things, obviously, which worries us most about the future, being big cities, in our case, in the European Union, of course. That's one of our big issues for the future. Okay, so thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Enjoy yourselves, and let's learn a lot. Thank you.
is the subject matter of what I'm going to talk to you about today. So in that book, I really look at the issue of global cities from the perspective of the international system and big historical change. So whereas Alfred talked about how Jane Jacobs talked about the sidewalk as her way into thinking about the city, I'm going to take it all the way up to the level of the international system and world order. And I think that's as it should be, really, because cities operate at multiple scales. That is one of the things that is so interesting about cities, is they're multi-scalar organizations. They have a multiple scale reach. So that's another thing that I will touch on today as well. Now, I know that the event here has been based around an increasingly important question, the internationalization strategy, or strategies of different cities. I'm not going to have much to say practically about that. I'm sure most people in the room will know more about that subject than I do. But what I hope to be able to add to your conversation is a historical and political perspective on the rise, the emergence of what I'm going to call the global city today. And I would make the point that if we're going to understand the context in which this trend towards internationalization is taking place, we do have to have an appreciation and an understanding of the historical drivers that have produced that trend. So I'm going to argue today that there's such a thing as the global city, and that contemporary global cities have unique historical features that earlier cities did not have, and that they have a distinctive historical origin, which I will trace to the 1970s. And those origins shape the possibilities and potentials of cities today, which is another point that I'm going to make. So in my talk today, what I want to do is tell a story. I want to tell the story of where the global city came from, which forces produced it, and what its existence may mean for our understanding of contemporary global politics and the international system. And eventually what I'm going to suggest is that the emergence of the global city is an indicator of quite a deep historical shift in the nature of international order. So my talk is going to comprise of 3 parts. The first part will be a short discussion of actually what do we mean by the global city when we bring this word into play. What does it mean? What are the unique historical features of the global city that set it apart from earlier forms of city? The second part of the talk will be an analysis of the historical drivers behind the transformation of cities over the last 4 decades. And these drivers will be economic, geopolitical, ideological, and technological. And finally, I want to look at the broader implications of the emergence of global cities for how we understand international politics, as I said. And not least of this, not the least important issue here, is that there is a recalibration going on between the relationship between the city and the state. So that's another important point that I'll come back to. So first of all, the definitional question. What is the global city? Why do we use this term? What does it signify? Now, I'm sure many of you will be aware of the many rankings of global cities that are out there, often put out by management consultants or the international press. Newspapers like The Economist all have these rankings. In these rankings, cities are ranked as more or less global based on a variety of different factors: their connectivity, their business environment, their economic strength, their social and cultural capital. All of these indicators are used to talk about which cities are more or less global. And they bring these things out every year, and cities go up or down depending on how well they're doing in terms of their strategy in each area. That's not really the way that I want to think about the global city, and it's not really the way that most academics have tended to think about this notion of the global city. For scholars, and for me, the global city is to be used more as a concept, okay? And it's a concept that allows us to start to think about the processes that are reshaping both cities and the wider political order in which cities are embedded. So in a sense, it's a concept that acts like a historical marker. It pinpoints when a major shift in urban form took place. The global city does not denote an object, but helps us to identify a set of processes that are transforming urban life to varying degrees in different cities around the world. So what are the transformation that this concept highlights? Well, I mean, all of you working in the area of cities, you will know that over the last 4 decades, there has been something of an urban renaissance. Cities around the world have changed almost beyond recognition. And they've changed in a number of important ways. They've grown in size immensely. Alfred made the point in his introduction that, over half of the world's population now live in cities. That is going to increase. And towards the end of the century, some forecasts say that we will be predominantly an urban species. So they've grown in size, they've grown in immense wealth, and also, importantly, they've grown in connectivity as well. So these are some of the things that I'm going to suggest are unique about these types of cities that have emerged in the last 4 decades. So firstly, global cities concentrate people, wealth, and power in one place. Covering just 2% of the world's surface, cities, as I said, now have over half of the world's population. It's estimated by 2050, this is going to rise to around 66%, and towards the end of the century, even higher. Global cities have become basing points for all sorts of global flows. Flows of people, flows of capital, flows of knowledge. And global cities are actually part of the material infrastructure of globalization. They form its backbone, if you like. Over 80% of global economic output is generated by cities today. They are the points at which productivity, innovation, and wealth converge. And over the last 4 decades, a fuller embrace of market logics under globalization has led to cities generating vast agglomeration economies. The second point I would say is they don't just concentrate people, but global cities have spread across borders in many ways. So we get the United Nations, for example, Habitat, talking about global city regions, mega regions, where global cities often merge together across national boundaries to create these vast transnational regions that are essentially integrated, polycentric urban agglomerations of quasi-continental size. So the mega region is human settlement on a historically unprecedented scale. Some examples might be, in the Pearl River Delta, Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Guangzhou has around 120 million people if you see that as one urban region. Tokyo, Osaka, Kyoto, Kobe may have 60 million people. Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, 40 million people. I could go on, there's a long list of these regions. And such regions are viewed as now the driving force of globalization. And they offer, and what's important about this is they offer a size and a scale that is more appropriate for the contemporary global economy than either the historical city was or even the territorial state of the last couple of 100 years. So there's something really important going on here that is challenging our perception of territory, borders, territoriality in the state. Now, the last thing that I want to mention is the connectivity element that I talked about earlier. Global cities also form networks that cut through geographical space and across geographical space. They use information technologies to generate increasingly deep social connections between other cities worldwide. Now, University College London are currently doing a study on these city-to-city networks, and they estimate that there are now something like over 200 city-to-city networks in the world today of various kinds. You'll be aware of many of them, I'm sure, in your own work. One of the ones that gets the most attention is the C40 Climate Leadership Group, which I'll talk about a bit later. There's Metròpolis, there's Mayors for Peace, there's the United Cities and Local Government. There are many, many of these networks. And the important thing to think about, which I will also come on to later, is that these networks are actually having increasing impact on global governance outcomes. Okay? So cities are having an impact on global governance, which used to be an area that was the preserve of the state and the state alone. So just to summarise what I've said there, that scholars, they tend to use the term global city to highlight these changes to urban form and practice. And that these processes are operating on all cities to varying degrees around the world. All cities are to an extent globalising. And this, of course, is why internationalisation strategy has become such a topic of interest. Now, the other thing that I would say about this is that we don't have to go very far back into history to find a very different outlook, a very different scenario for cities that was much bleaker than the one that we have today. So I want to take New York and London as two examples here, because those are two cities that are often considered to be on the very top tier of global cities, two of the most connected, two of the wealthiest. But both London and New York underwent a series of really severe crises in the 1970s and 1980s. Those were characterized by mass suburbanization, flight to the suburbs of many middle-class citizens, a great loss of industrial jobs as jobs went to the third world, enormous racial tensions in America and to some extent in London as well, so you had segregation, race problems, and all of this had led to an erosion of the urban tax base. New York City itself, as many of you will know, went bankrupt in 1975. Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister, abolished London's Metropolitan Council in the political struggles of the 1980s. And at that time, the future looked very bleak for these two cities. Yet, in the intervening decades, their fortunes have been completely transformed. They have become, as I said, key nodes in the material networked infrastructure of globalization. So in that period, from the 1970s to the present day, the processes that generated the global city, as we know it today, emerged. So our first step in understanding this phenomenon is to identify what happened in that period. What is it that reinvigorated these cities and gave them the wealth, connectivity, size and vibrancy that they exhibit today? To answer that question, I want to identify, as I said earlier, 4 historical drivers that have produced global cities. And those drivers will be economic, geopolitical, ideological, and technological. So first of all, global economic restructuring is an explanation for the global city. This is the most common explanation, that global cities are a product of economic globalization. And so they are. They are a product of economic globalization. In the 1970s, the global economy underwent a fundamental restructuring. Between 1945 and 1970, to use Karl Polanyi's terminology, market capitalism was embedded within a set of social democratic institutions that tamed the problems, the social dislocations that capital brought in its wake. But in the 1970s, that system was swept away. That system that we called the Bretton Woods system was swept away. In 1971, President Nixon broke the convertibility of the dollar into gold, beginning a reconstitution of the global economic system. And the Bretton Woods system was replaced by a system that freed up the market from many of the institutions that had tried to tame it in the post-war years. The central principles behind the reconstruction of the global economy in the 1970s were essentially neoliberal principles. A commitment to free markets, minimal state intervention in economic affairs, free movement of capital around the world, and the extension of the competitive dynamics of the market to as many areas of social life as possible. So it was this global economic restructuring that was initiated by states, and primarily by the United States, that has in turn forced cities to restructure themselves, to internationalize, to compete for the capital and talent, to generate an attractive economic environment in which to draw into itself those global flows of value which the new global economy has generated. So restructuring generated a set of structural conditions to which cities around the world have had to adapt. This less regulated global market has had the effect of supercharging cities, It's allowed freer rein to the natural agglomeration economies that only cities can generate. And again, this notion of the agglomeration economy was something that Jane Jacobs was very interested in. The idea that cities alone are the primary engines of economic growth. That cities are able to use their natural economic advantages that density and clustering bring to generate growth and wealth. But this, for me, as an explanation, is compelling, but it doesn't go far enough. And often in much of the literature that you will read on the global city, the economic dimension of its origins is the one that gets talked about to the exclusion of all others. But what I would want to suggest to you is that we must also look to other drivers for the character of contemporary global cities. For economic restructuring always rests on political foundations. It always must. So the second area that I want to talk about is the issue of the geopolitical foundations of the global city. So I've talked about how the United States was a key player in restructuring the global economy along ways that projected onto the international system its own set of liberal values. We need to look at the geopolitical configuration of the international system in the period in which global cities emerge. And the role of power and material power should never be neglected. So what was the configuration of international power in the 1970s? It was essentially what international relations scholars call a hegemony, US hegemony. So the US provided public goods for the international system. It provided international stability. And it is that form of international stability that has made the global city possible. It was the US and the US alone that had the geopolitical power to shape the international system and the world economy, both in 1945 with the Bretton Woods system, but also in the 1970s when that system was dismantled. And the endurance of a liberal hegemony, continuing to be underpinned by US political power, continues to be critical in allowing this type of city to survive. Because global cities are open cities. They rely on an environment of stability and open trade. They are the product of a type of global economy that US power and hegemony has made possible and secured. And if we were to see a shift in the nature of international order, that will place the type of city that we have today into question. I would also add to this an ideological component. So this is the fourth driver that I want to talk about, which has brought us the global city. I want to suggest that the emergence of the global city is part of a response to a crisis of statism that persisted throughout the 20th century. So by statism, I mean that form of political life in which states have substantial centralized control over political and economic activities. Now, throughout the 20th century, there were a number of big experiments in statist forms of political economy. It had been tried and found wanting in a number of ways throughout the 20th century. You can think about Soviet communism as an extreme example, or National Socialism as an example of statism. But another example of statism is social democratic Keynesian welfare style states that also failed and were replaced in the 1970s. Now, I would say that one of the things that neoliberal political public policy and philosophy is seen to be a solution to is the failure of statism. And the successful implementation of neoliberalism in many parts of the world, again, underwritten by US power, has led to a specific form of global order, a liberal-inflected, liberal-inspired order, one that has embraced decentralization, devolution, public-private partnerships of various kinds, all of the types of things that you would consider to be part of the city today, as opposed to the former philosophy of centralization, state control, top-down authority. These are no longer seen as efficient or desirable ways of allocating resources in many parts of the world. The emerging form of global order that we see is networked, it's decentralized, it's bottom-up. It involves a range of actors and authorities, not just the state anymore. And it is here, in this type of order, that global cities are increasingly taking a leading role. Now, the final thing I want to highlight here, the final driver of the four that I mentioned, is technological change. And this, of course, is all bound up in this shift towards decentralization as well. It has been the convergence of these other drivers with trends of technological development that has also been key to this. In particular, the set of technologies that have given us digital networks of increasing scope and sophistication over the last 3 decades or so. And such developments have had a number of important social effects. So firstly, the augmented information processing power that has been available has enabled the global marketplace to expand enormously. Digital technologies have facilitated decentralized networks of global scope, which cities are now using as part of their strategies. These technologies undermine traditional hierarchies, they undermine traditional ways of top-down control, and they allow increasingly deep connections across borders, generating increasingly sophisticated transnational networks. And this has really been key to the development of the city-to-city networks that I spoke about earlier. City-to-city networks of a transnational or global scope that in many issue areas have begun to bypass state authority and to have real impact on global governance outcomes. So together, these four drivers combined to generate the distinctive form that the global city takes today. What I want to stress is that these origins have a particular political character that holds implications for how we understand global cities today, both in terms of their possibilities and also their limitations. So the final section of my talk and the final thing that this has been leading up to is where do global cities sit in this new global order? So having discussed some of the reasons behind the emergence of global cities, I want now to focus finally on some of the implications of these developments, particularly for international political order. So where do these developments leave us? Well, first of all, as you all know, they leave cities competing for resources against each other in the global economy. And part of what internationalization strategy is about is how to compete best for these resources. But it's not all just about competition for cities either. These developments have also opened up other possibilities. So take, for example, the emerging cooperation between the many different city-to-city networks that have evolved in recent years. Now, perhaps the most fully developed of these groups is the C40 Climate Leadership Group, which is the last count, I think, that I did, 83 major cities that engage in strategic public-private partnerships with private actors such as the Clinton Foundation's Climate Change Initiative, also multinational corporations such as the Multinational Engineering Corporation, ARUP. They also engage with international organizations such as the United Nations. So again, this is the city operating on multiple scales at the same time to bring actors together. And the C40 group, as its name suggests, seeks to lead efforts to tackle climate change. Their methods include collective action, joint coordination, sharing and diffusing best practice models and technical know-how, so in areas such as transportation, energy and waste infrastructures, retrofitting projects, for example. So much of this is, again, within the liberal paradigm of learning, cities learning from each other, helping each other to improve. The C40 claims a number of clear and measurable successes in its attempt to contribute to the global governance of climate change. It says it has achieved 10,000 city climate actions among its members since 2009. And it's got a collective commitment to huge CO2 emissions reductions by 2030. And the C40 is having an impact on global governance. And what's interesting about it from an international relations perspective is that it is bypassing traditional state-based politics. This shift in itself is particularly important and profound, I think. But it is also worth noting that these strategies have certain features that are related to the liberal ideology within which I've suggested global cities work. So the C40's activities remain well within the discursive space of a liberal discourse. They frame their solutions in the language and philosophy of markets. They offer technocratic agendas. They are achieving these aims by partnering with private foundations and multinational corporations. And this is a strategy that ultimately is a market-oriented solution to urban challenges. So I think that's something that we also should bear in mind, that this is, our ideology is shaping the type of activities that are going on within global cities. But I would also highlight the fact that global cities have a certain type of power that is being demonstrated by what goes on in the C40 network. And it is a form of networked power. It's the power to convene other actors, whether they be international organizations, NGOs, corporations, civil society, universities. It's the power to convene these other actors, to bring them together, to set agendas. And this type of power is one that, as I said, often bypasses the old state-based system of international diplomacy. So while the C40 seems to promise a direct impact on climate change, state diplomacy over decades has yielded very little so far. Now, some have argued that these kind of developments mean that the state itself is becoming increasingly irrelevant as an actor, that a new political order is emerging in which the global city will become the leading political actor. So I don't know how many of you have read the book by the political theorist Benjamin Barber, which is called If Mayors Ruled the World, I think. And Benjamin Barber has gone so far as to call for the establishment of a global parliament of mayors that would act alongside and eventually supersede the state system. And this sounds like a very, very radical idea, of course, but he would argue that it's merely the formalization of what is already happening around the world, practically. He says we already inhabit this decentralized planet of network cities, provinces and regions, which are obviously now dominated by traditional nation states, encompasses a wide variety of sub-state and non-state actors, multinational corporations, global financial institutions, civic NGOs, global social movements. So for him, the capacities for global governance already exist in the various global city networks that have been constructed around the world. Voluntary and informal cooperation already occur across the many hundreds of city networks that have been built. And for Barber, this is a solution to two failures of the nation state in recent years. The first of these failures is the failure of the state and the wider society of states to tackle transnational governance issues, like climate change or the management of the global economy. He argues that this failure of the scale of the state and its capacities to tackle transnational issues has called forth a pressing need for alternative global governance arrangements, and this is what the city networks for him can fill. The second failure of the nation state for Barber is that he argues that states have become ever more distant from their citizens, that there is a widening democratic deficit that states cannot close. And for Barber, the city itself can be a renewed locus for democratic participation. As Alfred said at the beginning, city mayors are, in his reference to Lyndon Johnson, city mayors are often much closer to their citizens than national leaders can ever be. And so for Barber, it's in the renaissance of urban life that solutions to the dual crisis of the nation state can be found. He wants to see new scale-jumping municipal democratic bodies emerge, harnessing technological advances to join local participation with new transnational assemblies. This is his solution to the new global-scaled politics of the 21st century. Now, I don't know how receptive you are to these kind of claims. They are obviously, at first glance, very exciting claims for cities. But I would also suggest that they are rather overstated claims, and they skip over a range of issues. Most significantly, the power of the state is not going to go away anytime soon. States retain sovereignty. States retain legal primacy over their cities in most cases. States retain the monopoly of legitimate violence. Law and security remain the domain of the state. States retain control over city budgets in many cases, and often cities are starved of funds and thrown onto the global markets for development. In many cases, city mayors, which Barbara is placing so much faith in, are often political appointees of the state by the state themselves. And the final point that I made earlier, that I'll bring back now, is that cities rely upon the international stability that state geopolitics has provided them to thrive. So I reiterate my earlier point. Instead of the state being superseded by the global city, as Barbara may argue, such cities are themselves a result of state policies, of state choices in pursuing a deregulated global economy. Global cities are the product of state strategy, and we shouldn't forget that. They rely upon the state for the conditions of possibility and for their continued survival. No state power, no global city as we know it today. And yet, states have created a situation in which they have become reliant upon the global cities that they help to generate. The success of the state today rests upon the ability of its cities to tap into global flows of capital, talent, creativity, knowledge and resources. States are increasingly finding it hard to reconcile their own territorial scale with the issues that are thrown up by globalization, such as climate change. States are increasingly finding it difficult to govern the complexity of the global economy. Such issues require a leap in the level of technological knowledge required that is often beyond the state itself. So states must now rely upon other authoritative actors to provide the knowledge, expertise and capacity to deal with global governance challenges. Cities are becoming key actors in this emerging regime of global governance, which is a more complex and multi-scaled form of political order than that has been so long provided by the society of the states. And cities don't have to be sovereign to act in this new global order. Cities are not sovereign, but their power and legitimacy is of a different kind. They are self-organizing, transnationally networked, self-governing complex systems of a very different nature to the hierarchical, top-down sovereign state. So I'll just make a few brief remarks to conclude, because I know that we are a bit behind schedule. Firstly, the first point that I would stress to conclude is that the relationship between the city and the state is changing today. Now, the city and the state are two entities that have existed in different configurations over the centuries. The city existed long before the state. It was internalized within the state in the period in which we're most familiar with, especially the great growth of the industrial nation state. But contemporary events suggest that this relationship between the state and the city is changing once again, that cities have been partially lifted out of their national context and connected together in various transnational networks of unprecedented scope and reach. And indeed, cities are now often coming to see their interests as being in competition with their host territorial state. Now, Alfred asked me to make a point about Brexit at the beginning. I would say, if you look at what happened in the UK referendum, the split between London and the rest of England in the vote to leave the EU suggested that London was seeing its interests as very different to those of the rest of the country. Secondly, second point I would make is that the emergence of the global city requires us to reimagine global politics, to rethink the way that we see political maps, the way that we imagine political geography, to adopt a non-state-centric perspective and focus. Contemporary urbanization has generated new geographies that transcend state boundaries. Global networks present to us new political entities that challenge, first of all, our presumption that the state remains embedded within the national territory, and also our presumption that the state is the biggest political actor, sitting at the top of the political tree. Now, my example of the C40 earlier, if we think about that, it undermines that idea that the state is the biggest scale on which politics operates. It has 83 of the world's leading cities, with a population and reach that dwarfs almost any single state in the international system. Within the C40, 1 in 12 of the global population live. The C40 generates 25% of global GDP. This is a political assemblage that dwarfs the state and has capacities and capabilities that we're only just beginning to understand. Finally, final point I want to make. By empowering cities through their own political choices, states may have unleashed a set of political dynamics that they will find very hard to control in the 21st century. The shape of the global order that is emerging in the 21st century is now being formed before our very eyes. It's up for grabs. One thing is certain, I think, is that it will look very different to the international order of the past few centuries. But it is undeniable, I think, that the global city will be at the heart of this new global order. Thank you.
Okay, everyone. Well, thank you very much, Simon. My name is Robert Kizik. I'm Head of Studies here at eBay. Just to stand in for Alfred, I think has had to leave very briefly. We have maybe 2 or 3 minutes for any brief questions that you might want to put forward directly to Simon. Otherwise, I would suggest... Oh, sorry. I need to be in the microphone. I need the microphone so this can be translated. Anyone who has a very brief question now, perhaps 1 or 2 minutes, Simon could give to us to answer directly. Otherwise, I would suggest, since we're going to have a coffee break that's beginning almost immediately outside, if there's something you wanted to say to him, grab him and have a word in his ear then. So if there's any brief questions now. 1 at the back. We'll take this one. Any other? Giancarlo at the back. Gianluca, Giancarlo. So if you have you, sir, and then if you could tell me the question, I'll repeat it for the microphone, and then Simon will answer, and then we'll have coffee break.
Okay, so very quickly, do you see, you put this in a historical perspective, which is very interesting, and the last point you made is you mentioned the Brexit and the difference between both London and the rest of the country, and you can see that if it happens in other states, and even in the United States, right, it would be very similar. So, do you see an emergence of a conflict between the weak people, the people who are losing globalization, seeking protection from the state, almost against the interests of those we said are the winners of globalization, mostly tend to reside in the cities, although even in cities you have winners and losers.
So to very briefly paraphrase the question for the translators, the question is, given the example of Brexit and the trend between urban, global cities and cities that are perhaps more rooted in traditional forms of economy, is this a trend which you think, Simon, will be carried over into other countries, and is it something which is part of your longer historical narrative?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think to some extent you kind of answered the question within the question, but I do see that dynamic. I do see the Brexit vote, I think, was, when we really analyse it, was a process by many of the losers of globalisation. People that want to use the state to reshape, to become more isolationist, to protect people from these flows that are changing their national communities. Okay, so this is the point I was making about the state has unleashed a set of dynamics that actually have started to undermine our traditional notion of the nation state. And the state is, I would suggest, evolving from some kind of... The state never takes one form throughout history. So we've lived through a period, particularly since 1945, of the nation state. I think since the 1970s, this is evolving into something slightly different. Nationalism is still a very powerful force, but to some extent it's been disconnected from states that have pursued these globalizing strategies. So we're moving, I think, towards something like the market state, and it is in this system that the global city can thrive. As I said, if we revert, this is not an irreversible process. You know, it can be reversed politically, and this is exactly what the Brexit thing is a step towards. It's a step towards deglobalization. So, yeah, the future's up for grabs, but I think there is that tension between the winners and the losers of globalization, and the winners tend to be within cities for the reasons that we've discussed.
Okay, well, I would like to thank Simon once again. Just outside, really, we've got to stick to time because we've got quite a strict schedule. Sorry about that. So, Simon, thank you very much once again for a very interesting, compelling summary of global cities in history. And I would like to invite you to join us all outside for a coffee break and a little pastry.